Few figures in modern history have been so persistently framed as a singular driving force of historical change as Adolf Hitler. From Nazi propaganda to post-war popular culture, Hitler has often been depicted as a leader of extraordinary will, strategic brilliance, and visionary clarity, a man who reshaped Germany and Europe through the sheer force of personality. This image, while superficially compelling, collapses under sustained historical analysis. Drawing extensively on the work of Ian Kershaw, particularly Hitler 1889 to 1936 Hubris, Hitler 1936 to 1945 Nemesis, and the Hitler myth, we make the argument that Hitler was neither a great leader nor a genuine visionary. Rather, he was an ideologically rigid, administratively weak, and often disengaged figure whose power rested on propaganda, structural dysfunction, and the radical initiatives of others acting in his name. Kershaw's interpretation represents one of the most influential reassessments of Hitler's role in modern historiography. Without diminishing Hitler's responsibility for the crimes of the Third Reich, Kershaw strips away the myth of omnipotence and replaces it with an analysis of how power actually functioned within a modern dictatorship. In doing so, he exposes the profound gap between the image of Hitler as an all-seeing Führer and the reality of a leader whose authority was symbolic, whose governance was erratic, and whose vision was little more than a set of obsessive ideological fixations. At the core of Hitler's authority stood what Kershaw famously termed the Hitler myth. In the Hitler myth, Kershaw demonstrates that the image of Hitler as an infallible leader was not simply imposed upon German society by propaganda, but was actively sustained because it fulfilled deep psychological and political needs. In a nation traumatized by military defeat, economic collapse, and perceived humiliation, Hitler became a vessel for collective hopes of renewal and national redemption. The myth presented Hitler as standing above the Nazi Party and the state apparatus, a leader who was supposedly untainted by corruption, endlessly self-sacrificing, and uniquely attuned to the will of the German people. Failures, brutality, and repression were attributed to underlings, while successes were credited personally to the Führer. This allowed many Germans to reconcile their belief in Hitler with growing awareness of the regime's violence. Critically, this myth compensated for Hitler's lack of genuine administrative leadership. As Kershaw shows, Hitler did not need to govern effectively so long as he remained symbolically authoritative. Loyalty to Hitler was emotional and ideological rather than rational or evidence-based. The Führer cult thus masked systemic dysfunction and transformed personal incompetence into perceived strength. Hitler is often described as a visionary, yet Kershaw makes clear that this term is deeply misleading. While Hitler possessed unwavering ideological beliefs, racial antisemitism, social Darwinism, and the necessity of territorial expansion, he lacked the intellectual depth, flexibility, and coherence that genuine visionary leadership requires. Hitler's worldview was remarkably static. From the early 1920s to his final days in the bunker, the core elements of his ideology remained unchanged. He did not refine his ideas in response to new information or changing circumstances. Instead, he interpreted events through a rigid ideological lens, dismissing inconvenient realities as evidence of betrayal or weakness. Kershaw emphasizes that Hitler's ideas were neither original nor sophisticated. They were drawn from a crude amalgam of Völkisch nationalism, pseudo-scientific racism, and conspiratorial anti-Semitism that was widespread in radical right-wing circles. What distinguished Hitler was not intellectual creativity, but fanatical conviction and rhetorical intensity. This is ideology as obsession, not vision as strategy. Moreover, Hitler showed little interest in translating ideology into detailed policy. He offered broad objectives without specifying means, leaving implementation to others. The result was not visionary governance, but chaotic improvisation. One of Kershaw's most significant contributions is his analysis of how the Nazi state functioned in practice. Contrary to the image of a tightly controlled dictatorship, the Third Reich was marked by overlapping jurisdictions, institutional rivalries, and chronic administrative confusion. Hitler did not resolve these conflicts, he encouraged them. Hitler's leadership style was profoundly anti-bureaucratic. He despised routine administration, avoided paperwork, and refused to establish clear chains of command. Ministries competed with party organizations, regional authorities clashed with central agencies, and personal access to Hitler mattered more than formal authority. In this environment, power flowed upward rather than downward. Officials sought to work towards the Führer, anticipating his wishes and radicalizing policy in the process. This dynamic, as Kershaw argues, was central to the escalation of repression and violence, including the implementation of genocidal policies. This system reveals not strength but abdication. A great leader coordinates institutions and imposes strategic direction. Hitler instead functioned as an ideological reference point around which chaos revolved. His authority was immense, but his governance was minimal. Kershaw's interpretation of the Holocaust further undermines the notion of Hitler as a master planner. While Hitler's antisemitism was central and his approval indispensable, Kershaw rejects the idea of a single, long-standing blueprint for genocide. Instead, the final solution emerged through a process of cumulative radicalization driven by wartime conditions, bureaucratic competition, and ideological zeal. Hitler set the parameters of exclusion, dehumanization, and racial struggle. Within those parameters, subordinates escalated policy step by step, often without explicit instructions. Hitler intervened selectively, typically to endorse or legitimize radical measures already underway, rather than to initiate them in detail. This pattern again highlights Hitler's lack of practical leadership. The most destructive policies of the regime emerged not from coherent strategic planning, but from a system incentivized to radicalize itself in pursuit of perceived ideological loyalty. The myth of Hitler as a military genius represents one of the most enduring distortions of his leadership. Early foreign policy successes and rapid victories in the opening stages of the Second World War have often been attributed to his brilliance. Kershaw offers a far more critical interpretation. Hitler's early triumphs were largely the result of opportunism, the reluctance of Britain and France to risk war, and the professionalism of the German military. Hitler consistently underestimated risks and overestimated his own judgment. Success reinforced his belief in personal infallibility, encouraging increasingly reckless decisions. As the war progressed, Hitler's limitations became fatal. He ignored logistical realities, dismissed expert advice, and interfered obsessively in operational decisions. His refusal to permit strategic withdrawal, rooted in ideological dogma and personal obstinacy, led to catastrophic losses. Rather than a strategist, Kershaw portrays Hitler as a gambler whose luck eventually ran out. His leadership during the war exemplifies not visionary command but delusional rigidity. Kershaw's portrait of Hitler's personal habits further dismantles the image of tireless leadership. Hitler worked irregular hours, avoided sustained engagement with policy, and increasingly withdrew from reality as challenges mounted. He preferred monologues to discussion and affirmation to critique. This indolence was not merely a personality quirk, it shaped the functioning of the regime. Hitler's absence from day-to-day governance created a vacuum filled by competing power centers. Decision-making became erratic and policy coherence deteriorated further as the war intensified. The Führer state depended on Hitler's symbolic presence rather than his practical involvement. His authority was personal, charismatic and ideological, but profoundly shallow in administrative terms. Kershaw is careful to balance structural analysis with moral clarity. Hitler was indispensable to Nazism, Without his ideological obsessions, personal authority, and legitimizing presence, the Third Reich would not have taken the form it did. Yet indispensability does not equate to greatness. Hitler's historical significance lies not in exceptional leadership ability, but in the catastrophic consequences of combining ideological fanaticism with unchecked power in a dysfunctional system. His weaknesses, vagueness, indolence, rigidity, were not accidental flaws, but defining characteristics of his rule. Ian Kershaw's scholarship fundamentally dismantles the notion of Adolf Hitler as a great leader or visionary. What emerges instead is a far more unsettling figure, a man of limited intellectual depth and obsessive beliefs, elevated by circumstance and myth, presiding over a regime that radicalized itself in his name. Hitler's authority was symbolic rather than strategic, ideological rather than administrative, and destructive rather than creative. The persistence of the Hitler myth remains dangerous precisely because it obscures how modern societies can produce catastrophe without genius or brilliance at the helm. Kershaw's work reminds us that history's worst outcomes often arise not from exceptional leadership, but from the lethal interaction of ideas, institutions, and human complicity. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to Blistering History.